Water brought most of our ancestors to this continent. And water took them westward into it. Water was their road to freedom and sometimes riches, their source of inspiration and adventure. That's also true on a boat named Driftwood for a group of young Americans and Canadians right out of college. Over a 3-year period, they covered 25,000 miles along the waterways of North America, from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico. A professional crew operated the boat while teams of young people documented the journey. Among them, Bill Arnold from Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario. Tom Miller, a graduate of the University of Florida. And Paula Chestnut from Ohio State University. Travel with them to visit the places and meet the people they discovered along the way. Like a one-man crime watch whose beat is a river. A place that proves you can take the city out of a kid and put a little country in. And an Englishman who's building on Henry Hudson's reputation. Join the crew of the Driftwood on this leg of their journey as they explore one of America's most historic rivers and the man-made channel that linked it to the rest of the country, the Hudson River and the Erie Canal. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Since 1883, when Emma Lazarus wrote those words, millions of immigrants have passed by the Statue of Liberty on their way to the American dream. Millions more, like the crew of the Driftwood, have stopped for a closer look.
I've seen photographs of the Statue of Liberty, but you have a different sense of it, I think, when you're coming up upon it.
The thing that I kept finding myself thinking while I was sitting there with all these people was wondering what it would be like to be there in a moment sort of alone.
Very few have the chance to find out. Just the staff that stays on when the crowds leave the island and the people who live there. Yes, live there.
You go out when the visitors are gone, and then when they come back, you know, it's like you come back into your own little niche back here, you know.
Jay Lippert worked for the National Park Service, where living on site is part of the job. He was transferred to Liberty Island from Big Cypress National Preserve in South Florida. His wife, Dawn, couldn't wait to make the move.
We lived there for 2 years. There was more wildlife inside than outside. And it wasn't hard. Bugs and whatever.
The snakes had a key to the front door.
Yeah. I mean, I walked in one day and there was like a 3-foot snake in the kitchen. I said, fine, I'm going to New York.
One day that we were there, they were having a birthday party for one of the kids. The kids were there eating cake, normal things that you do at a kid's birthday party, and then the backdrop for that was the Statue of Liberty, and that's not the kind of thing that you really think goes on that island, so it was a big surprise.
There are 5 families that live out here. So the Park Service in itself is its own little family, and kids have a good time here. After the island is closed, I mean, the front side of the island is full of bicycles and baseball bats and dolls and carriages, and you just have to make sure that you clean up before the next morning so that the visitors don't find all your things.
In 1985, Lady Liberty got a complete makeover. When you have a mouth 3 feet wide, an index finger 8 feet long, and a waist that measures 35 feet around, beauty treatments take time. And so for a year, the island was closed. Since it reopened in 1986, over 10 million people have visited Liberty Island. Imagine having to share your neighborhood with hordes of tourists 8 hours a day, 364 days a year.
The year we got here, it was the year before they closed the island. A lot of people thought the island was closed. So on a normal day, they'd have 3,000 to 5,000 people. They had 18,000 yesterday. That difference in the amount, it's just too crowded for me now.
There are some real drawbacks living here. I mean, my wife works a half mile away from where she lives, but it takes her almost an hour to get there. Depending on what time of day she starts, sometimes she has to take 2 boats just to go to work.
And now there's another commuter to worry about, their 5-year-old daughter, Marcy.
Once she started school is when I really started feeling the pressure of being on an island. She doesn't have, you know, after school, can I play with my friends? Well, unless I make a boat arrangement for her or have one of them come over, she doesn't get this.
They face the problem of trying to live a normal lifestyle against the backdrop of not only the Statue of Liberty, but against the Manhattan skyline, which you see from this little island that's in the middle of everything.
It's not the only island in New York Harbor, not by a long shot. There's Ellis Island, Governor's Island, and the biggest island of all, Manhattan.
It hadn't really occurred to me that it's an island. I think a lot of people tend to forget that. But it is an island. It's completely surrounded by water. And that presents a problem. How do you get there?
From the deck of the driftwood, it was apparent: bridges. As they headed down the East River around the tip of Manhattan and onto the Hudson, the boat passed under 7 of them. It also traveled over 4 major tunnels, which linked the city to New Jersey and other parts of New York.
I mean, you've got people coming in from, commuting in from up to 2 hours away, even from the Pennsylvania-New Jersey border. So it is the draw in this area. There's nothing else like it.
Evan Lerner is a systems analyst for a firm on Wall Street. His wife Ellen does media research for a company on Madison Avenue. They met in New York City, they work in New York City, and they agree on one thing: they don't want to live in New York City.
It's got all the excitement built into it on the business front, and on the social front it's also exciting, and the mix is good, but towards the end of the day and at the end of the week you need some place to regain your sanity.
So they commute.
Outbound Queens Midtown Tunnel with a 10 to 15-minute delay. Inbound a 15-minute wait. Inbound Manhattan Bridge very slow across the span. Outbound Manhattan and Brooklyn Bridge.
The New York metropolitan area is one of the most densely populated in the world. Since 1980, the number of vehicles registered here has risen over 25%. Expressways are clogged with twice the number of cars they were designed to handle, and there are hour-long waits just to cross the Hudson.
When I first started working, I drove to work. And for a year and a half, I pulled my hair out. I left the house at 6:15 in the morning because I had to hit the bridge by 7 o'clock at the latest. If there was a slight bit of rain, it would take me 2 hours to get into Manhattan.
It's just not fair. I mean, to spend close to 2.5, 3 hours of traveling time when you're 12 minutes away.
Up until the early 1900s, people came into the city by ferry. But after the bridges and tunnels were built, many chose to drive across the river instead. And that's when the traffic jams began. So in 1986, a new ferry line was started. The Port Imperial Clipper service leaves Weehawken, New Jersey every quarter hour from 6:45 a.m. to midnight. It takes 3 minutes to get to Midtown, 15 minutes to Wall Street.
You're sitting on a bus in traffic, and if you're sitting on a corner waiting for the bus for an hour, or a commute to turn from an hour into 2 hours and a half, your mind starts wandering, and you think, maybe I'll try that ferry.
7,500 people a day take one of the 4 Port Imperial ferries that crisscross the Hudson 5 days a week. Another service has opened in Hoboken, and others are sure to follow.
it's easy, it's convenient, and it's most importantly pleasant. I mean, because a lot of New York is not pleasant. A lot of our days are not pleasant. We both service clients and they yell and scream.
Their jobs are stressful enough without them having to worry about how to get back and forth. And so the ferry has been their solution.
If it's beautiful weather and you sit up top, there's nothing like it. If you can brave the wind and can master the art of, of origami with your newspaper, then it works out fine.
It's a great way to start your day and a great way to end your day. And the sun is setting, and you really feel like you own a yacht. That you're like this big yachtsman.
Commuters are not the only ones to rediscover the river. Like many places across the country, New Jersey is reclaiming its waterfront. Abandoned docks are now prime real estate, and factory buildings like the one Thomas Edison built to manufacture his first incandescent lamps stand vacant, waiting to be turned into restaurants, condominiums, shopping malls. In the last 20 years, they've managed to clean up much of the raw sewage that was dumped in the river. But now oil tankers are threatening the water. Close to 16 billion gallons of bulk liquids, mostly oil, are shipped through the New York harbor every year. And there are reports on the average of one spill a day. Most are too small to cause public uproar, and many people think there's not much worth saving there anyway. But they're wrong.
I was expecting the Hudson to be something terrible because you hear all the jokes about how terrible the Hudson River is and how it's just a waste dump for a lot of people and a lot of companies. And you're really taken aback by the beauty that you see.
As you go further north, it takes on a feel like a fjord. It has large mountains on both sides, and it still has that pristine, that beautiful look that it once had.
Right now, the Hudson is the only major estuary on the East Coast that still has its historical spawning stocks. Every other major estuary on the East Coast is missing at least one or more of those species, including the Chesapeake and the Potomac and the Delaware.
Biggest one
John Cronin grew up on the Hudson in Yonkers, New York.
I was part of a generation of kids who were taught that the Hudson was a dirty place, a bad place, a place you kept distant from.
So for a long time, John stayed away from the river. Then when he was 30, he took up with a bunch of commercial fishermen.
I left my job, left my apartment, moved into the back of a pickup truck and parked on a friend's dock and said, here I am. And I learned a lot about how the Hudson works, different times of the year, different seasons, what it means to have part of your livelihood depend on being out in the water.
The more time Cronin spent on the river, the angrier he got. He began collecting evidence of illegal discharges by polluters and brought his findings to the U.S. Attorney's Office. He expected nothing to come of it, but the case became New York's first successful prosecution of a polluter under the Clean Water Act.
I was astounded. Because I didn't know anything. All I was just a volunteer running around counting pipes. And all of a sudden, I was hooked. It was like I had found a religion, getting bad guys in trouble. What a great thing.
By the time Driftwood caught up with John, he was getting paid for it, too. The Hudson River Commercial Fishermen's Association had hired him on a full-time basis to keep watch.
His office is the Hudson River. He doesn't stay cooped up doing his research from books and things like that. He's out there finding his own stories and relying on the things that he hears every day to keep him motivated and to keep him investigating the things that are going on.
Okay? Thanks, Dad. Bye-bye.
You think, how can this whole river, this entire stretch of water, be protected by one man? He's got to go from Albany all the way to New York, and it seems almost too much for him. But then you meet him and you realize that he creates an alliance of people along the shore.
Would you happen to notice if the railroad came through with their spray trucks? Yeah. How long ago?
Unfortunately, the abuses happen all too often, like this quarry operation, dumping rock into the river.
Now you can say, well, it's only gravel, it's only sand. But the fact is, the sand and gravel that ends up on the bottom here covers up plant life, ruins the natural bottom, and then an area like this ceases to be a habitat. I wouldn't have to waste my time coming over here if you guys could see pick the stuff out of the river, huh?
People don't realize that what they do has an impact on a whole lot of things that go beyond just their immediate action. And I think John, as the river keeper, is trying to get people to accept responsibility for what they're doing.
Well, listen, funny guy, why don't you tell this guy to just be a little bit less sloppy, do a little bit more raping? It's not my job! It's not your job? It's a good attitude, man. Unfortunately, there are people who run businesses and there are people who run industries, even municipal sewage treatment plants, who are thinking in their head the same way this guy talks out loud. But when we get them in court and we get them out in the newspapers and we get them talking about this publicly, they're not laughing anymore. Matter of fact, usually what happens is they lie.
He presses it to action in the court systems because slapping them on the wrist isn't enough.
We want them to be embarrassed that they did something wrong. We want them to have to part with money that they'd rather use for something else. And that is what we try and make happen. And we've been successful at it.
Mostly because of John's record, other places are putting guardians on the water. There's now a Long Island Sound keeper, a San Francisco Bay keeper, and a Delaware River keeper.
The thing that stands out in my mind about John Cronin is the potential that one person has in a battle against corporations, against millions, possibly billions of dollars, that one person can make that difference.
The driftwood left John Cronin and headed north into George Washington country. During the Revolutionary War, he headquartered here. He slept here. And toward the end of the war, he was almost made king here. Disgruntled soldiers, unhappy with the way the country was treating them, wanted to overthrow Congress and put Washington in its place. He told them he hadn't gotten rid of George III just to become George I of America. They had fought too long and too hard for that to happen. The Hudson played a significant role in that war, and no location was more crucial to its outcome than the one known as West Point.
And it wasn't until I came through on the boat that I realized that West Point was this monument sitting on the Hudson River, and it has this historic and strategic significance that a lot of people usually don't think about.
One person who does is Lieutenant General Dave Palmer. He first came to West Point as a cadet. He's been to Vietnam, worked at the Pentagon, and commanded a post in Germany. Now he's back as superintendent of West Point.
Situated against the cadets, he kind of reminded me of the way you see West Point against the Hudson River. It's just a commanding power that is a little intimidating, a little forceful, and certainly commanding of your respect.
For the first 50 years of our existence, we were the only engineering school in America. So people from here were those who found America, mapped it, explored it, built it. We were the civil engineers that developed the country.
Lieutenant General Palmer holds a graduate degree in American history. And at West Point, the past is hard to ignore, particularly if you're a cadet.
From the first day they get here, they all take an oath on the parade ground back here where Washington drilled soldiers. We take them out and in a formal course study the history of the Revolution, the military history of the Revolution in this area.
West Point's role in the American Revolution began in 1775 when the Continental Congress decided to wage war on the British.
And they actually, not knowing what to do, set a precedent that we followed ever since. When we've been faced with a really tough, vexing question, they appointed a committee. But that committee was chaired by George Washington, Congressman. And he came back with a series of recommendations, one of which was to put defenses right here so that British ships could not go up the Hudson River.
General Palmer was able to point out to us a different significance of the river, its strategic significance. He told us that originally the Hudson River used to be the center of the 13 colonies, and if the British were able to penetrate that river, they'd be able to win the war.
Half the Americans lived east of the Hudson and half lived west. And if the British could take the line of the Hudson River, as they called it, with their fleet, the New York and Pennsylvania and Jersey and Virginia, those colonies would have been unable to help those in New England.
The problem was the British had a fleet and the Americans didn't. So if the Continental Army wanted to stop the ships, they had to find a place on the river where they could do it from land. On the entire Hudson, there was only one place that would do, the twisty, narrow stretch where the mountains hit the river, West Point. With strange currents and tides and winds, it was difficult sailing under the best of conditions, and the Continental Army was determined to make it impossible. The plan was simple: string a chain across the Hudson. But this was no ordinary chain. It measured 1,800 feet across and weighed 150 tons. Each link, there were 900 of them, was 2 feet long. Word of the chain got out. The British didn't even attempt to get through.
And then all of the defenses at West Point were aimed at the river. They protected the chain. And the man-made defenses tied into what nature had put here. And it became, for that day and age, and the way wars were fought then, as close to an impregnable position as men have ever devised.
The chain he talks about is right there, the Hudson River is right there, the overlook, the strategic point, it's all there.
You just can't come here and not somehow go away feeling better, just uplifted. And that's partly for the natural magnificent beauty around us. The mountains, the way the river cuts through, the scenery is special. But then you add to that natural beauty all the traditions that the name West Point evokes. And it says that there's no place in America, no place in our country like this. Nothing can touch it. And you know that if a guy from Texas is going to say something like that about any other place in the country, it's got to be true.
Driftwood left West Point passing through some of the most dramatic scenery on the river, the Hudson Highlands. It's one of the few places where the Appalachians, the major mountain chain in eastern North America, is broken by a river. The Hudson is at its deepest here, 200 feet. Rising on either side are formations so old their age cannot even be estimated to the closest 10 million years.
You felt like you were on a river that sounds more romantic, like the Rhine, because you had the just shapes and things that were just hard to believe.
We always like compare to the Rhine River region. It's very similar. We grow grapes, they grow grapes.
When the crew happened upon Cesar Baeza, he was pressing those grapes into wine, and not just any wine. According to Cesar, it will be the best champagne ever produced in America.
He's taking local grapes and he's trying to create something of quality that is unique to the area.
It's all part of his plan to make the Hudson Valley one of the top wine regions in the country. It's not such a far-fetched idea. Some of the earliest attempts at growing grapes in America were made along the Hudson. And the oldest winery in the United States, Brotherhood, is still doing business here in Washingtonville, New York. It was started in 1839 by a Frenchman who made sacramental wines for the local Presbyterian church. Years later, when Prohibition shut down other wineries in the area, Brotherhood was allowed to keep going. After all, it was for religious purposes. The sweet Concord wine may have kept Brotherhood in business, but it did nothing for its reputation. Then, a couple of years ago, Cesar took over as wine master.
Anymore, but form of what you call a bouquet. That's what the agent does, and that's why you need the cork to do that.
For years and years and years, people are used to tasting the kind of wine that used to come out of there. So he's got to change everybody's mind.
He has this little festival to promote the winery and find out what it's all about.
Go!
Grape stamping is a festival that we have every year for fun. People come into the tub. They love to crush the grape with their feet.
It wasn't as bad as stepping in mud, but it was close.
Whoever gets the more juice in a 2-minute stamping with the music and everything, they win a prize.
But when it comes to making wine, Cesar is after bigger prizes than a bottle of Chateau Lafite. Of the 62,000 or so tons of grapes used for wine in New York, only about 1,000 tons are grown in the Hudson Valley. Still, Cesar believes his area is capable of producing grapes as good as those in Europe. And the key to that is the river.
What the Hudson River does for Cesar and his grapes in the vineyard is it tempers the climate, and he's able to grow his perfect grape that he's looking for to make the best champagne or the best wine or what have you.
As the crew of the Driftwood was beginning to discover, there's more to the river than what flows between its banks. The Hudson watershed covers 13,000 square miles. Any drop of water falling within that area that isn't absorbed into the ground or evaporated into the air eventually finds its way to the river. And it's not hard to figure out how it gets there. The Hudson Valley is packed with streams and lakes that flow into and out of each other. 3 of those lakes are located in Fishkill, New York, 65 miles north of New York City. It's a perfect place for a summer camp, so the crew was not surprised to find one there. What did surprise them were the campers. Most of these kids come from places where summer vacation usually means playing in the street. And water activities have nothing to do with rivers or lakes. In 1877, a Pennsylvania minister asked his congregation to give kids living in New York tenements a chance to get out of the city during the summer. He set up something called the Fresh Air Fund, which gets its money from private donations. Now, every year, needy kids are treated to 2.5 weeks in the country, all expenses paid.
I never swam in the lake before.
So what do you think about it?
It's all right. At first, when I thought about it, I was like, fish in a lake? No, I'm not getting in. But it's all right. You know, it's not really terrible. It's just like a pool at home.
They've overcome the fear of being in the woods and being in the dark, being in their cabins that don't have doors. Then by the end of camp, they feel really comfortable.
Kim Berglund is one of the counselors here. Coming from a small town in Indiana, she at first had concerns of her own.
They're very street smart. I mean, New York City, I mean, how rough can it get?
Where are you from?
Brooklyn, is more nature around here.
Yeah?
Over there's more, more gangs and everything. Oh, yeah. There's more to learn around here.
More to learn? What have you learned here?
I don't know.
I know.
I learned a lot of things. I learned how to hike. And some of the kids said, you know, they learn manners. They really need that. And you know what I learned? I learned that I don't miss my mother at all. I don't.
Your mother gonna get you now, girl.
I'm telling you. I feel so
She gonna spend you.
They're incredible. They're hilarious. They're spontaneous. They're mean. They're cruel.
If you went and told her that you felt good about her, she might feel good about you, and then she might not be so snotty.
Whether they're poor or rich, they're still going to have the same kind of feelings inside.
Well, go tell her you feel good about her.
The camp handles about 650 kids per session. Girls on one side of the lake, boys on the other.
Wait a minute, what's across the water?
The boy!
What's your favorite thing to do at the camp?
Swim. Start looking at the girls over there, swim.
You meet these kids at the camp and they look like any kids playing anywhere. They're having fun, they're relaxed, they're having a good time. You start talking to them and you realize where they come from.
I got one. You got a fish. Help me, man. Back up, man. Back up. Pull it up. Where's the string at? You supposed to take it off? I am taking it off. I gotta get the pole free. That's why I put it back in the water. Here, John, hold this. Somebody hold this one here.
There you go. You still want it?
Yeah. Yo, you got any gloves?
Just take the fish off.
The thing that you realize about these kids that this neutral setting is only temporary, that maybe 2 weeks every year or 2 weeks for 1 year they'll get to come here and do this, and then they have to go back. I think it's interesting that when we try to heal people or try to bring out the best in people, we ship them out of our cities and we ship them to the country and we ship them to where they can swim and be at the water and be relaxed and be healed in an environment like this.
It gives them a chance to get away, you know, and whether we reach one kid out of the whole summer or 2 or 3, there's always going to be a little bit that's going to be well worth our time and money, and especially well worth their time to be here.
The Hudson River Valley has provided a summer escape for generations of New Yorkers, poor or rich. One of the oldest resorts in the area is in New Paltz, New York, the Mohonk Mountain House. A Victorian castle with a view of the Catskills, it has been in operation since 1869. But from the very start, the building has taken a back seat to the surroundings. Over the years, it's attracted people as diverse as naturalist John Burroughs and industrialist Andrew Carnegie, not to mention the crew of the Driftwood.
Mohonk was incredibly beautiful. Everywhere you looked, there was a photograph.
Ted Spiegel obviously agrees. He's a photographer whose work has been in a number of publications, including National Geographic. He's traveled all over the world for assignments. 60 countries, 50 states. But his favorite subject is the Hudson River Valley.
I don't think of the Mississippi as my river, and I don't think of the Rhine as my river, but I certainly couldn't live without the Hudson. I find it's just a great place to explore, and it's maybe surprising to people to think of the Hudson as in New York, and therefore it's some kind of an extension of New York City. The Hudson has primitive areas, it has historic areas. It's really a treasure.
Ted's wife, Signe, is a photographer too. His enthusiasm inspired her to take it up.
God, it's beautiful. How nice of you to get these for me. Thank
you. You're welcome.
Just beautiful.
I figured you liked this guy. He was really neat.
When he's upside down.
A photographer has a very privileged position. I mean, I have a license to stop and look at things that people would just pass by or not even notice or even look for. And a good example is just going into a garden and suddenly realizing that there are butterflies there. And if people can get some sense that the butterfly is of value, they at the same time will notice when the butterfly isn't there. And they'll wonder a little bit about what role they play in the butterfly's life and what role the butterfly plays in theirs.
That analogy holds true for the river. It was Ted's photographs that helped convince the New York State Legislature that the Hudson was a wilderness area worth saving.
And I find that with a camera I can add value to something. I can focus on what we want to preserve. You know, what's at stake. Because what's at stake is something rather very, very incredible. It's beautiful. This is not Orlando, Florida. There are no theme parks recreating America. This is America created right here. Okay? And you can just go out and find it.
Yeah, I just did that, yeah.
The photograph that most impressed Bill Arnold was a view of the Hudson taken from Olana, the home of landscape artist Frederick Church. And so the crew stopped by to take a look for themselves. Church once wrote, "About 1 hour this side of Albany is the center of the world. I own it." The house itself is a work of art, but Olana, which means place on high, exists for the scenery.
You can understand why at that particular place someone had built a house, because the view is just, it's spectacular.
Church said the windows were like picture frames surrounding the outside beauty, something he never grew tired of painting.
Olana was an observatory for Church, and he simply stayed in this observation platform and watched the changing drama of the skies.
How nice to have been a painter and live in this place. I mean, it just all comes together. And again,
Clara Sauer and Jim Ryan are both guardians of Church's legacy. Jim, as curator, safeguards the treasures of Olana, but Clara protects the view. She heads an organization called Scenic Hudson. Unlike John Cronin and Ted Spiegel, Clara Sauer was not born on the river. She first saw it when she moved here from Germany with her husband.
It was love at first sight, and it's the most beautiful area in this country and possibly in the world. And it is unspoiled. It hasn't been touched that much by civilization.
I think it's significant that she came from a war-torn Germany. I mean, I think that plays a part maybe in her passion for life and for living and experiencing things that are pretty and that are beautiful.
And that's what Scenic Hudson is all about. We try and preserve those very special places so that future generations can get as much pleasure out of these areas as we do now.
In the 10 years since Clara took over, they have successfully fought everything from polluters ruining the water to the city of New York using it up. But as the name suggests, Scenic Hudson's biggest fight is with the builders who threaten to change the face of the river forever.
There's a sense of urgency that pervades everything you do, because if you don't intervene and if you don't become active quickly, you lose it. And once it's lost, it's gone. That doesn't mean that all development and all change should stop. It is inevitable, and we need to grow and change. But how that change occurs is very, very important.
Scenic Hudson has protected many pieces of land and put entire towns on the National Register. But as the area becomes a more desirable place to live, public property is becoming increasingly private. Clara wants to make sure everyone, including herself, will always have access to the river. And naturally, she has a plan.
We would like all the urban areas parks, habitat areas, biking paths, connected with new ones, so that you will have a chain from Manhattan all the way to Albany. And what we hope that will do is create a new sense about the Hudson Valley, about this wonderful place, in all people.
What Clara Sauer was able to do for me was to show me that the eye is important. A power plant may destroy the environment and may destroy the ecology of the water, and I learned that from other people. But what I learned that from Clara is that it also destroys a view. And along the Hudson River, a view really counts.
For generations, the scenery has attracted some of New York's wealthiest families. The Rockefellers bought huge sections of the New Jersey Palisades just so development wouldn't destroy the beauty they saw from their side of the Hudson. The Roosevelts wouldn't even let death come between them and the river. A provision in the family's will prohibits anything from ever blocking the view from their Hyde Park estate. But if the wealthy protected parts of the Hudson, artists immortalized it. The Hudson River School was the first art movement to come out of America. These landscapes have been described as a romantic, less realistic style of painting, but only by those who have never been on the Hudson.
Going on the boat through all of this beauty, you see the same amazing pastels and colors that the artists were able to capture in their paintings that long ago.
When you look at these views, you can understand why someone would want to dedicate a great part of their life to preserving them. They're just absolutely breathtakingly beautiful.
Driftwood headed north to Albany, following a route made famous by the man for whom the river was named. Henry Hudson first entered these waters in 1609 on a ship called the Half Moon. He'd been hired by a Dutch trading company to find a northeast passage from the Netherlands to the Orient, but he thought he had found a better way to go.
Everyone kept trying to pay him money to go northeast, and he kept sailing northwest. Hence he ended up in Albany.
Like Hudson, Nicholas Miller left England for a job that took him across the ocean. And when the Driftwood crew met up with him in Albany, Nicholas was working on what appeared to be Hudson's Half Moon.
This is an exact replica of one of the vessels he used. Even though the construction techniques are modern, the actual way that the ship is rigged and the way the ship will handle will be exactly the same.
The people who were working on Half Moon at the time we were there all seemed very dedicated to the building and the sailing of the Half Moon. And Nicholas is overseeing all these people.
For the planking, we can take the bandsaw off and you can put those two knees in as well. What I do for a living, I work on tall ships and build them and rig them and sail them. I've been working here just over a year now on this project, almost since the beginning. And it's fun. Beats working for a living anyway.
Ever since he was a kid in England, he's wanted to build these kind of ships. He worked with computers at IBM, and he gave that up to realize this goal.
You just don't get the opportunity to work on a vessel like this, and you'd have to build at least half a dozen of these, really, before you got good at it. I've managed to make myself a career of doing this, of going around and working on these ships, and you're creating something, and that's nice.
I really enjoyed spending time with him and seeing the Half Moon from his point of view. I think he represents a lot of the adventure the original Henry Hudson had.
It's not all fun. No job is. But I think the end thing is that you can look back and say, I enjoyed that, I created something you can be proud of.
The The $1 million replica is the idea of an American of Dutch descent who felt it was time people stopped giving the English all the credit for settling the country. Religious tolerance, the Bill of Rights, free public education, and Santa Claus were just a few of the Netherlands' contributions to American culture. And if Henry Hudson hadn't traveled this way, they might never have come here. Hudson's trip upriver was his third attempt to find a passage to the Orient. But the water becomes unnavigable here, and he was forced to turn back. The driftwood, however, had no problem continuing on. But then they had the Erie Canal.
When you're growing up, you hear a lot about the Erie Canal, and you read about it's a major transportation artery, it's a major industrial artery. And then you go down the Erie Canal and you say, wow, I'm on the same canal that settled this country.
Before it was started in 1817, a lot of people didn't think it was such a good idea. The only other canal in America had been near Boston, and it had failed miserably. People who backed the project were ridiculed, no one more so than the governor. As it turned out, DeWitt Clinton had the last laugh.
Clinton's Ditch, as it's so called, was probably America's first man-created water highway.
With its opening in 1825, goods could be shipped all the way from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes by way of the Hudson River. The cost of moving freight was reduced from $120 a ton to $14 a ton. And the Erie Canal became the center of America's Industrial Revolution.
Once you're traveling along the canal, you see all these abandoned buildings that, you know, have not been renovated and stand as they did, but there's no activity. You couldn't help hearing sort of whispers from the past and when there were kids working in the factories and things. This sort of hung in the air.
One of the windows you look through, you find that in one small portion of these huge buildings, somebody's still doing it the way they used to do.
Nancy Laren and her husband Martin run Swan Knit, a company that makes baby clothes in Cohoes, New York.
They're the kind of people I wouldn't expect to find in this huge, big vacant building in the middle of nowhere in Cohoes.
You see Marty in the machinery part of the factory working on thread and threading the machines and fixing any problems, and he did look very much out of his element. I mean, you could picture him in a law office or walking on Wall Street in New York City, but certainly not in a factory.
As a matter of fact, Martin was a lawyer and a banker. He had no experience in the clothing industry, but Nancy did, and she wanted a chance to run her own business. So Martin quit his job, and together they looked for a company they could afford. They found it in an old brick building once owned by Harmony Mills. Located on the eastern entrance to the Erie Canal, with power provided by nearby falls, the mill was one of the busiest in the area during the 1800s.
They mainly employed women and children, and I've heard maybe 15,000 people worked here. It was apparently the biggest cotton supplier in the country, like during the Civil War. So this whole 5 stories was all looms, spinning cotton, all driven by the water.
We've seen pictures of the way it looked, jammed as far as the way it looks now. And it must have been tremendously noisy and hot.
Although Marty and Nancy aren't facing the hardships that the people earlier faced, they're still taking a big gamble in their efforts. What they're trying to do is do it American. They're utilizing the local labor.
It's one of the reasons it's tough for people like us to stay in business in the United States, because you need laborers, and overseas laborers are a lot cheaper than American laborers. But I'm determined.
They've given up their lives in the city. They've given up their jobs, and they've come here to put everything at stake to make this work.
There were a lot of sleepless nights when I wondered if we'd thrown away every penny we'd earned up to that point, and maybe I would be going back to banking. After you get a couple months under your belt and you realize, you know, tomorrow's another day, it hasn't been so bad, and it's actually been, by and large, it's been extremely enjoyable.
Like Harmony Mills, the Erie Canal has undergone a number of changes. When it was finished in 1825, it was the longest canal in the world, 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and 200 miles long. But as industry picked up and ships got bigger, they had to keep enlarging it. And in 1903, a whole new waterway was built, the Erie Barge Canal.
And the neat thing about it is that as you're traveling along, you can see remnants of the old canal right beside the newer one. You realize what an engineering feat it had to be at that time of the building.
It wasn't just a matter of digging a ditch. From the Hudson River, the water table rises 425 feet within the first 100 miles. So a way had to be devised to mechanically lift boats to meet the next level.
Upon entering into the canal, there's a series of locks that you must step up. But prior to arriving at lock number 17, you didn't realize the enormity of the rising and lowering of this level.
Lock 17 in Little Falls, New York, is the highest lift lock on the Erie Canal. And when the driftwood came through, Keith Fraser was at the control.
He's doing a very important thing there. He's lifting boats 40 feet where there used to be a waterfall. And if it weren't for him doing that, then these boats wouldn't be able to get through.
The lock was designed to handle the commercial traffic that once dominated the waterway.
It's something, you know, just to be a part of it. And it just makes me feel good when a boater comes through and says, you know, thank you for the lift or thank you for the locking, you know. And it gives me a lift.
These days, Keith mostly handles pleasure craft. An occasional cement or molasses barge will still lock through, but the Erie is no longer considered an industrial waterway. Commercial traffic on the canal has been reduced by 2/3. Meanwhile, the number of pleasure craft has doubled in the last 10 years. Recreational boaters traveling between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic have discovered that this is one of the best ways to go. And the people in charge of the canal are determined to keep them happy.
Traveling through the Erie Canal on driftwood, we did see some evidence of a move towards this romanticism and attracting the tourists.
But as the driftwood neared the end of its travels on the Erie in a town called Sylvan Beach, the crew was reminded that for some, it is still a working waterway. And they met a man, Chuck Dwyer, who would like it to stay that way.
And then understandably, because that's his history, that's his family's background. His family has lived by the canal. His parents worked together on the canal. The canal is a way of life for him.
Chuck Dwyer has been operating a dredge boat on the Erie since he was 16. He's responsible for keeping the water a constant 15 feet deep by removing the dirt that naturally silts in.
He likes to call his dredge a huge vacuum cleaner, and that's the exact image I got. He's actually sucking the stuff off the bottom and putting it over into a levee on the side.
The job itself hasn't changed much since Chuck was a teenager, but in those days, the canal was far more industrial.
And they put the pipeline in, and of course that took a lot of the oil barges. They opened St. Lawrence up, and that took care of the grain barges.
He's seen a lot of changes in the canal, and he probably wishes it still had that importance, because he was there when it actually did.
According to Chuck, there was more camaraderie in those days. The pleasure boaters are friendly enough, he says, but they're just passing through.
The old canal, you knew everybody. The captains all waved to you, toot their whistles, and how are you, Chuck, and how you been today, how's the family? This is the way it used to be. And you miss that part of it, but yet you have to look forward and you have to be strong enough to make the change yourself.
This is what he knows and this is what he loves. And even though it may be a little sad for him today, there's no place else he would ever go, I don't think.
Sylvan Beach was Driftwood's last stop on the Erie Canal before entering the Great Lakes. And as the crew looked back on their journey, they realized that everyone they had met was in some way connected to the past.
And that's a good way to maybe look at the Erie Canal as almost a living museum. And you find just the few people that are actually making a living from the canal itself as sort of the curators. Check dryer trying to keep the canal open. Nancy and Marty Laren trying to bring back some of the history at Harmony Mills. And Keith Fraser watching over one of the old locks.
And I think that those connections are hard to miss when you travel up and down the Hudson. You talk to Clara Sauer, and she gets very excited about the artists and the scenic views that are along the Hudson. You talk to people like Dave Palmer at West Point, and you realize, wow, this is where Washington, during the Revolution, set up camp.
The trip brought it to a real personal level. I mean, you hear the Hudson River, it's worth saving. It's historical. A lot of people have painted it. And then you find out, you see the paintings that were painted. You meet people who have this look in their eye like, this is it. This is the thing that I'm saving. This is my life.
They are the people that are standing guard and watching over the entire length of the Hudson so that no one will destroy it. And if you're to spend any time in and around the Hudson River, you can see why they want to do that.
In the weeks ahead, join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel more than 25,000 miles and rediscover the stories along the waterways that link the people of North America with one another and the rest of the world. Come along as they explore man's relationship with the water he treasures and despoils, plays with and fights with, and cannot live without. Join these young people on the next leg of On the Waterways.
Funding for this program was provided by the Bamana Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana.